Today's webinar is going to be about the Undisputed Recognition Award workflow, and that's kind of obviously a very biased approach as to what we feel at Reviewr is like the ultimate way to run these types of campaigns. Now, many of you on the phone, obviously within an association kind of space or a nonprofit space, are not just doing recognition awards. It might be scholarships, it might be grants, it might be fellowships, it might be board nominations, conference call for abstracts, and while each of these campaigns is very unique and different in the sense of like the type of content being collected, how you do the selection process, at its core, there's really three main consistencies that are shared amongst all of them. There's a submitter experience, there's a program operations experience, and there's a judging review selection experience. And so we'll talk mostly about awards today, but with that said, there's a lot of kind of key takeaways and items that we're going to kind of run through that very much apply to some of those other types of campaigns as well. There are so many moving parts and aspects that go into a member recognition award kind of process. And so instead of us going step by step through things like marketing and promotion and kind of the product planning stages of things, we'll send that out as like an additional resource. My goal today is primarily to talk about kind of 5 key areas. Let's go ahead and make this not quite so blown up here. There we go. So my goal today, again, those 5 kind of key areas that we're going to talk about. Why is that happening? There we go. Is going to be the nominator workflow and the nominee workflow. So I love to see these type of award campaigns broken into 2 very distinct workflows where we have nominators that come in and then we have nominees that come in. Each one of them with this very kind of specific task at hand about the type of content we're collecting from them, how they're going to interact with us, and why we do it that way. We're going to get into things like reference collection. I think obviously with a recognition award, references are becoming a much more popular type of element to add to these campaigns. And so if we're going to be doing that, how do we maximize the usage of it? How do we lower the barrier for the people writing the references, as well as how do we power kind of a fair, non-biased review and selection process with a consistent experience? And then that kind of leads us into the next 2 elements, which is going to be how do we take all of our applicants or all of our nominees and assign them out to a committee for review and selection. There's so many different ways of handling that task. How do we kind of find this middle ground that is both efficient and cognitive to their time, but also ensuring that the nominees get the fair review process that they deserve? And then from that perspective, like what does a fair, non-biased review and selection workflow look like? Leveraging the blending of data or potentially even things like score sheets and automatic result tabulation. So those are the key things that we're going to get into today. Before we get too much further, though, just a really quick kind of like 2-minute introduction of what we do at Reviewr and who we are. So, Reviewr has been around now for well over a decade. We did so from kind of our own experience, what I call funding opportunities. So we were very heavily involved from like a volunteer review team perspective. So, going back in time and like this little time capsule, all of these campaigns at one point in time were done through paper. So if you think through your recognition programs, it was all happening through like 3-ring binders. We'd have literally hundreds and hundreds potentially of binders mailed to the review committee's doorsteps, and they were asked with reviewing them, handwritten notes, feedback, scores. A lot of times it was in-person meetings on the weekends. And as you can imagine, as a volunteer, it was extremely overwhelming. Over time, you started to see this transition when organizations would go online. And what that really meant is that they attempted to run their awards through like their AMSs. They tried to use spreadsheets, emails, downloading documents, built-in web forms, and all of those tools in its own sense are really great at what they're intended to do, but none of them are meant to run award programs or these kind of complex application selection workflows. And so as a volunteer, it actually created more work for us because instead of physical paper, while very heavy, at least it was centralized. Now we're using like 8 different platforms and tools, none of which are intended for the task at hand. It resulted in a bunch more work and also opened the door for a significant amount of human error. So we started to hear these horror stories of people messing up their formulas in their spreadsheets and actually picking the wrong recipients. We heard from organizations that actually sat down and then they found out later on that the committee who did the selection process had a bias kind of a mindset going into it. So they reviewed people and made decisions based off of like who they knew, demographic backgrounds. There was a scholarship campaign that actually collected applications via email and a whole bunch of people into a spam filter. And so the foundation sat down to do a selection process. And then they found out months later that they didn't even review all of the potential candidates because they were sitting in that spam filter. So these are the experiences that we kind of lived firsthand. And we basically said, this cannot happen any longer. They're far too important of a campaign and program to your organization to kind of let that happen. So that's what led us to build Reviewr as an online platform that's intended to run those entire programs, the entire life cycle from literally start to finish, with kind of a couple main goals. So obviously, number one is how do we help you and your team spend less time and energy on spreadsheets, emails, downloading documents, but much more important because you only make up like 30% of these programs. How do we elevate the experience for the applicants, the committee members, the volunteers, the board members, all those individuals as well, to kind of lower the barrier, provide a more structured approach. So that's kind of what our background looks like. Digging deeper into actual kind of goals here today. So the first item that we're going to talk about, again, I'm going to kind of pop over to Reviewr here in just a second to show you what this experience looks like. It's going to be kind of that nominator nominee workflow. And so with these types of recognition programs, I love to see kind of that built-in process where it's broken into two different stages. Stage number one is going to be the nomination. So nominators come into the platform and they put in, basically who are they nominating, and why. Now, again, you can kind of break this for a lot of different reasons, but the general idea here is that from a pure marketing perspective, how do we increase volume and how do we increase participation? And quite frankly, the only way to do that is two ways. One, word of mouth, and two, lower the barrier. With that said, if you lower the barrier, then you're leaving some stuff on the table. So for example, like how do you get essays? How do you get references? How do you get file uploads, right? So the idea is to kind of put that burden on the nominee themselves. And so we start with a nomination process where people come into the system or come into your process and they say, hey, I'm either self-nominating or I'm nominating somebody else. If they're nominating somebody else, they're going to say, here's who I am, here's who I'm nominating, here's why. We're also going to encourage them to submit potential multiple nominations. Again, pure word of mouth, getting the volume up. And then we want to lower the barrier. So no account credentials for them, making them go through these extra hurdles that are completely unnecessary. We want to figure out like what's the lowest amount of information that you need from them to actually conduct these types of campaigns, and then leave it at that. There's no need for them to be submitting numerous file uploads or having them submit these comprehensive essays and paragraphs. I totally understand the concept behind trying to surprise the nominees with these nominations. It's exciting, it's fulfilling to them, but there's just too many barriers that come into place with that process. So break the process into two. Obviously, leveraging a platform like Reviewr makes this much more feasible because you can actually create these automatic triggers, which we'll look into, where once the nomination gets submitted, one of two things can happen. It could notify the nominees directly saying, hey, so-and-so, you've been nominated for this year's 40 under 40 award. Click here to finish your application. Or it can come into like a staging area where your initial team can kind of go through the applications, you can vet them, you can sort them, and then you can actually decide at the end of the day who you want to invite to that next phase and then trigger it later on. So it doesn't have to be fully automated, but obviously a platform like Reviewr does offer that ability. It's also nice too, because if you have multiple nominations coming in about the same person, which many of you might be having currently, how do you kind of consolidate, 4 or 5 nominations about Tony and put them into one spot? So again, that's kind of where Reviewr comes into play. And then the other recommendation I would typically make is there's always going to be a concept of dates and deadlines with these programs. Applications open, applications close, review processes start, and then you have an award ceremony. And the latter half of that, I think, should still occur. You should have dedicated review periods. You should have dedicated times where you announce recipients and then have your ceremonies, because we'll get more into this later on, but like from a revenue generating perspective, the awards gala, the signing up, the meals, all that is a very important aspect for you. With that said, how do you always increase the volume and the word of mouth? Because at the end of the day, the most hot timing for people to submit nominations is right after that prior cycle's award nominations are awarded, right? There's always buzz about the program. People are always super excited. So how do you not let that go dormant for many, many months before starting again? So you can do one of two different things. I wrote on this kind of guide that we want to be collecting nominations all year, so the ABCs always be collecting. That's step number one, where on your website or on your submission process, you're collecting nominations 24/7, 365 days a year. And then you have these dedicated kind of pods of when you do your award results. So it could be the fall and the spring. It might be just once per year at the annual gala, but that's fine. You just take the trailing X number of months applicants, review them, do your recipient collection, and then start collecting applications immediately right away, again, until the next selection process. Alternatively, you can do what I call like an intent to submit. So again, the idea, if anybody on this call is a marketer, is we want to have kind of the qualified lead aspect where we're always collecting the data of who these nominees could be. So that way, when the applications actually open up, you almost have like this marketing list that you can leverage to invite them to begin the process. So that inherently is going to kind of increase the volume of applications that you're going to receive. As I kind of talk a bit more, I am on the right going to kind of show you a reviewer on this, but the last thing I want to note to this too is that no matter what process you go with, you want to make sure that you're tracking the data of both the nominators and the nominees. And I'll show this to you. What I mean by that is it's very common for people to begin nomination forms and even more common for people to begin applications to start the workflow. They want to see what's being requested from them. They want to start the beginning, the working on the process. And then they stop to either work offline to go gather additional resources or just because they don't have time at that given moment. So if that is the case, I think you as an organization need to better understand like who are these people, how far have they made it, the ability to send them built-in reminder messages, because at the end of the day, humans will always procrastinate. And so how do we kind of say, okay, well, we know that's going to happen. So how do we just identify who they are, send them built-in reminder message, which is better for conversion rates. You're going to have higher volume, but B is you might also start to get those applications coming in a bit sooner versus waiting to the last minute, which also just causes in general some challenges. The other reason why I believe that this is important is because from a pure, I guess, recruiting perspective, if your program doubles overnight, I'm not saying that's going to happen for many of you, but if it did, do you have the bandwidth and the review committees in place to handle that increase of volume? And what I mean by that is you can't just say, hey, you were a reviewer last year, now you're going to review 2 times the number of people, because that's not a feasible or sustainable model, because that's not going to be something that they can do. Like they just can't increase volume because inherently their quality of their review will go down. So the number in progress, both nominations and applications, very much is a leading indicator to what your total volume would look like. And then that in return leads you to kind of recruit additional volunteers, recruit additional staff members to assist with the processes. It also might lead you to change some of your processes in your workflow. So for example, maybe now you have to inject a vetting phase before you begin the actual judging. So what does this kind of look like? So in a review, again, this is not meant to showcase our platform, although we will kind of review it. It's more so how do you kind of look at what this workflow would look like. Is the nominator would come into the system. Typically, we want to use your web presence. You've got strong content control, you've got strong branding control, so we should leverage that. And then from there, you're going to link to whatever platform you're using. If you have multiple award categories or multiple awards in general, that's fine. We don't want to see a bunch of separate links or a bunch of separate forms. Instead, send them to a centralized kind of award microsite. And then from that page, we can start to have people fill out these forms that either A, say based off of your information, this is what you're eligible for, or pick from this list what award you want to submit to. And then the system, at least within Reviewr, would recognize that choice and say, because you chose the 40 under 40 award, we're now going to put you into this workflow, which might have different submission forms, different dates and deadlines, different selection criteria, et cetera. So again, we're trying to take all these moving pieces, all these different awards, all these different forms, all these different dates and deadlines, and at least put them into one centralized process to make your life much easier, but then also from the applicant's perspective. So a lot of our clients do prefer to use what I call these marketing landing pages, just because it does serve as a nice middleman between your web presence and the portal. But it's also nice because it allows you to reiterate those dates and deadlines, reiterate the eligibility and the criteria and things like that. Now, again, from a pure nomination perspective, it's pretty common for them to kind of bypass the account creation side of things, because again, we want to lower the barrier, and then it drops them right into the application form. I did, just for the sake of time, break this out. So what we'd want to do is we want to have like this initial kind of submission form that says, hey, nominator, who are you? Who are you nominating? In a few short sentences, explain why you're nominating them, and then they submit. From there, 2 things will happen. They're going to be presented with a thank you page that says, thanks for your nomination. Do you want to submit another? But also then it triggers that next workflow, which is either to you as a program manager that says, okay, nomination came in. Now, do you want to notify the nominee automatically, or do you want to manually do it? Again, there are some benefits behind doing manual notifications, because you might want to make sure that they're qualified. You want to make sure that they're actually in good standing. Though you want to make sure that they're a member. And then alternatively, you could just completely automate this, where the email notification goes out, says, dear Laura, you've been nominated by Kyle for this year's program, or you've been nominated for this year's award. Click here now to begin your application. And that's actually where I want to take over now, this next part of the conversation, which is the actual physical nominee process itself. So it depends on the content you want shared. Some of our clients actually want the nominees themselves to see what was submitted about them. And you can blind it, so they wouldn't necessarily know who submitted it, but you can at least see what the information was. That way they can edit it and say, no, that's actually not my email, or no, that's actually not my phone number. Or what they instead do is they'll have their own kind of separate submission that gets merged with the nomination, which I'll show you. So if that is the use case, the main reason why we're doing this, and this is just over years and years of experience, is that this is going to sound really bad, but if I was submitting a nomination about my wife, it probably wouldn't be as good as the nomination she submits about me. And it's not because I don't love her to death. It's just because she's a better writer than I am. She might put forth more time and energy than I will. And so is that a fair representation of the nominee, or is it more so on the person that did the nomination? So the goal is to lower the barrier. Who are they? Who are they submitting and why? And then from that point on, it's also been very common that even though the nomination that came in was, trying to nominate them, they're not going to have things like file uploads. They're not going to have resumes. They may not even know their personal contact details. And so that's critical data that you need about the nominee. So why would you have it be submitted directly from the source itself? So all those kind of really personal stuff that gets submitted about them. And also from like a pure file upload or essay perspective, we can't ask the nominees to put in like an hour of time filling these out. We only have maybe 3 to 5 minutes. With that said, if you want to win this award, then let's go ahead and make them spend the time and energy writing the essays. It's a direct reflection on them and their stuff. Another pretty common workflow we've started to see as well is a pay to accept a nomination process. It's a bit of a polarizing conversation, but not everybody is able to apply to an award. You might have a very minimal kind of payment to actually submit. So it turns into a revenue generating opportunity, or just offsets some costs for you as an organization. Again, by no means is that required, but if you are going to do something like that, this is the time to start to inject it. So what does that look like? So off my right-hand side now, I'm basically logged in as a nominee. So I got a notification. I came into the platform. Typically, it's going to tell them which award or what award category that they were nominated for. With that said, we do have some of our clients that offer so many different award types or so many different programs that they can do one of two different things. They can either pick which award they want to apply for, or some of them make them fill out like these little quizzes, quote unquote, that at least within Reviewr, it reads their answers and says, hey, you're actually eligible for this award as well because you're under the age of 40, or for this reason as well, because you've been a member for over 20 years. And so it helps kind of bring visibility to these different types of categories that they just previously or historically wouldn't be aware of. For those of you on the call as well who offer like scholarships within your foundation arm, great use case, right? Of making scholarship recommendations based off of, GPAs or what colleges that they want to go to, things like that. So applicant comes in, they start to answer some of those questions. This is the eligibility quiz that I talked about. They then will pick the award category that they want to submit to. This is really where the rubber hits the road, at least within our platform, because a couple of things are happening. Number one is because I'm applying to the Technological Advancement Award, it's going to drop me into a bucket on the back end. So you're starting to categorize and create these workflows based off of what award that they chose, but also the subsequent questions that are about to appear are going to be hyper specific to the technological advancement versus maybe, for example, community impact. So we're basically catering a very custom experience to the applicant based on how they're interacting with the system. As far as the content itself goes, this is another great use case of where, typically speaking, the nominator may know obviously the person's name and their phone number, but things like their address, their email, the number of years that they've been a member, all those potential other questions that you want to start to collect from them, like you just have to have this come directly from the source. Similar examples when we get into things like the essays. So in this use case, I have 5 or 6 different questions, all of which have, potentially upwards of thousands of character limitations that are built in. There's just no physical way that a nominator is going to put the time and energy into these questions that is a fair representation of the nominee. So nominee comes in, they input their information, they can save, they can log out, they can come back later. Again, this entire process is going to be a direct reflection on the award category that they chose. So we're catering the experience, and then it gets into things like file uploads. So within Reviewr, we can take in about 130 different types of files. Another great use cases. In this example, it might be like a reference, or it might be a resume. The nominator just isn't going to have it. And if they don't have it, they're going to get it from the nominee anyway. So why wouldn't we just ask the nominee to submit it? But they can take in all these different types of files. I'll show this to you, but every document collected in Reviewr gets embedded. So your team can physically view videos, PowerPoints, Word documents, PDFs, all right in the system without having to download them and go use other external tools. So I'm going to pause there because this next part of the section is going to be what we're going to talk about, which is collection of references. For those that are still left on this webinar that haven't kind of bounced to eat lunch or anything of that nature, if you're doing references, leave a note in the comments, or if you don't do them. The reason why is I'm trying to get a better understanding of how common this is. I know it's super popular within the scholarship making space. We've started to see it bleed into award programs. I personally feel that collecting references is incredible because now when we go to review applicants, we have kind of three distinct points of data. We have the nominations that came in, we have the data about them, and then we have a complete third-party, non-biased perspective about the reference themselves. With that said, they're not easy to create. So one thing that I want to start to see more of here in 2024 is let's avoid reference letters. And the reason why I say that is letters historically are very challenging to create. Number one is if you're being requested to write a reference, you're being asked the very last minute. So you have very little time to actually do it. Number two is you have to start from nothing. So you sit down at a blank piece of paper or a blank computer screen, and you have to come up with all these different ideas of what you want to talk about. It takes a whole bunch of time. The other piece of that too is then going back to my example about them submitting a nomination about my wife. She's also going to submit a better reference about me because she's just a better writer. So is that a fair representation of me as the candidate, or is it a fair representation of the person writing the reference? So one thing that we love to see at Reviewr is two things. Number one is automation. So let the reference know very early on in the process that they're submitting a reference. That way they can get started. And then number two is avoid reference letters, but instead do a reference template. So what ends up happening is off to the right here in Reviewr is the applicant would just simply put in the name and email of who is submitting the reference. Notification goes out to, in this example, Tony gets an email that says, hey, Kyle's asked you submit a letter of support on his behalf. Click here to do so. They then would click on a link. And then that link, instead of going to a file upload, would instead go to what I call a reference template. So like, what are the 3 to 5 questions that you want every single reference to talk about? That way, A, you're lowering the barrier for the writer, so there's answering questions right in front of them. But then number two is that when you go to conduct a review and selection process, you're actually comparing apples to apples because every single nominee has the very exact same data associated with them. It also opens up the opportunity to start to blind the data easier and do things like that. So again, in Reviewr, notification goes out, they create the reference, they submit it, and then in real time, that reference gets automatically added to the applicant's profile, where at the end of the day, as a program manager, you're going to have your nominee, you're going to have all the nominations submitted about them, you're going to have all of the references, you're going to have all of their files, all centralized into one kind of concept called a profile, which I can also show you if you're interested. So next piece of discussion, and this is kind of, I think, one of the more important aspects that we're going to talk about, is how do you take all of your submissions that you've collected, all of your nominations, and then divvy them out to your team for review and selection? And why are we going to do it the way that I recommend? So number one is this is physically impossible, likely, for your team to review all of the submissions. Even if you have, only maybe 20 award nominations, it's a substantial amount of time. And it may not be a lot of time in the perspective of hours. By the time you get to number 18, 19, and 20, their focus has definitely changed. So are they giving those applicants the fair time and energy that they deserve, that they gave to their first couple? So one of the things that I love to see is breaking these review processes into what I call buckets, either based off of multiple phases of review. It could be committee-based review. It could be a award category review. If it is multi-phase, there's like an initial vetting, kind of a yay and nay pile. And then from there, it gets into like the deeper due diligence, judging, scorecarding concept, et cetera. So how you decide to structure those buckets will be very much up to you. What I would say is the most common approach is a combination of 3 things. Number one is award categorization. So if you have multiple awards or multiple award categories, in Reviewr, the system will automatically identify the applicants based on which ones they applied to, drops them into that bucket automatically. And then you can have like a dedicated pod of team members who are in charge of reviewing that category. Level number 2 on top of that is going to be multi-phase. So at least within Reviewr, you can make data required. So you're not going to get incomplete nominations, but it's still very much best practice to at least review your applicants really quickly before they move on to like the actual judging process. So thumbs up, thumbs down, yay or nay pile. You can still use score sheets, but typically it's a quick kind of vetting process. And you can have your vetters in multiple award categories. But again, we're trying to divvy those out. And then kind of the concept of randomization. So again, If you had 150 or 200 submissions, instead of saying, hey, let's review everybody in that award category, let's now say, just because you're part of that pod, you're only going to look at 5 of them, right? To be a much more manageable number. So again, typically this is done in combination. So all 3 of those methods are used kind of simultaneously. So when you go to do the review and selection process, people will just advance from one bucket to the next based off of those parameters. I also will get more into this, but I also want to make sure that we talk about both randomization of judges, just because, again, from a time and workflow perspective, I typically can't review all of them. Number 2 is I want to make sure that we're blinding data. So hiding potentially key personal identifying information, demographic backgrounds, things like that doesn't kind of influence the judging and selection process. And then the third thing I want to talk about is a concept called normalization of results. So some of the organizations that we work with have found over the years that some of their committee members are just stingy. They're hard asses, right? And so that shouldn't be a bad thing, but it is if their average scores are being taken into consideration. So we developed this kind of proprietary review process called normalization, where it basically will identify those individual judges and figure out like how high or low are they in comparison to other judges' averages, as well as like what is their average. So if you have a 30 point score sheet and this judge has never given higher than 12, getting a 12 isn't bad. That's actually the very highest that judge ever gave. And so how do we start to normalize that, create these baselines of averages, and then compare both judges and applicants against those averages to have kind of very fair, non-biased selections that take that into consideration. I'm not going to get too deep into that today, but I do like to see those types of score sheets being included. So what does a review process look like? And a question came in asking for recording this. Yes, we will absolutely send this out as long as with some examples as well, score sheets, submission forms, etc. So, and from a program operation perspective, we basically want to create those buckets first and foremost. So in Reviewr, you'll add your staff either individually or you will upload them. And then once they're in the platform, here's that concept called buckets. And what I try to do in this example is create kind of 2 different use cases. Because I mentioned beforehand that there's going to be award categories, phased review, and then also randomization. So let's look at all of those at once. So I have these buckets called innovation leadership, community impact, technological advancement. Those are like my different awards or my different types of award categories. So in real time, when nominations are coming in, the system says, hey, Kyle applied to the community impact category. Therefore, let's drop him into that category with all the other candidates that apply to it. Now, from an operational perspective, you can move people around. You can change this. We just want to kind of get the ball started for you. The next step here I want to talk about is that multi-phase review. So you'll see that I also have a finalist selection, an interview phase. You might have like a phase 1 vetting process. And so the concept of buckets is not meant to be siloed. It's meant to work together. So what basically happens is that we've got these buckets. We'll use the, for example, sustainable development bucket, and then we'll fill it up with a team. So in this example, Simon, Paula, Mark, Judge Judy, when they come into Reviewr, they're only going to have access to the nominees in the bucket that we gave them access to. So we've already accomplished a couple of different things. We've already accomplished breaking down the nominations by category and giving them to dedicated pods of committee members. But now let's go even further with 2 specific use cases. One, which is going to be randomization / workflow management. And then number 2 is conflict of interest. So if I open this bucket up, it's actually going to show you a list in real time of every single nominee, the number of people who are reviewing it, and then who those individuals are. So you can do one of 2 things. You can actually give each review member a random number of submissions, or vice versa. You could say every single nominee will get looked at exactly 5 times. And so within Reviewr, you would actually type those parameters in. The system would read that and then say, okay, let's give each one, in this example, no more than 6 review members, but nobody can get less than 4, right? So we automatically did those assignments. The next piece to this is, okay, great. We have these buckets of these pods of people. We then started to do randomizations to make the workflow management much more specific. But what happens if there's a conflict of interest, right? So in the review process, you would typically have like in your score sheets, the ability to flag, hey, I have a conflict of interest. So if that is the case, what you would do is you come back into the system and say, okay, well, Mark flagged a conflict of interest because he's golfing buddies with Gabrielle's dad, or maybe they serve on the board together, whatever the reasons might be. You can actually override everything we just did and uncheck Gabrielle and then assign him out to Gilligan. So again, we took at a very high level all of our nominations and all of our reviewers and started to break them into these pods or these buckets. We then opened them up. We did random distribution, and then now we're on a very one-to-one personal basis, pairing them up. Now, at the end of the day, once the review process is done, you're going to take the top X number and then move them from one phase to the next. So we'll kind of get into that next. And that is kind of where we're going right now, which is the actual review and selection process. Now, I totally understand the desire to do like a deliberation or a kind of a comment-based review process. With that said, those deliberation meetings should absolutely have data-driven decision-making involved. So what I prefer to see at Reviewr is some type of like quantitative or judging scorecards that at least help prioritize the candidates based off of those metrics, as well as help power those discussions. One thing that I feel passionate about is that in these types of award programs, we typically don't want them to be comparative. So we're not comparing one nominee to somebody else. What we're instead doing is we're reviewing the nominee's profile and the content submitted, and then the results that we're submitting will then automatically compare them or evaluate them against other people. So again, we want to keep this short and sweet. Your review committee only has so much attention. Much like your applicants, they will always procrastinate and wait till the last minute as well. So like, what does the bare minimum judging process look like? And kind of stick to that. Typically, it'll match up with your organization's mission and vision. It'll match up as well with the nomination form. So references, nominations, short answers, and essays. I'll share out some examples after this of like what some common score sheets might look like, but we want to make sure that they stay hyper focused when they're doing their judging process. Again, I like to see multi-phase review. So at least initially we want to have like a quick kind of thumbs up, thumbs down vetting process. And then we get into the full-blown score sheet process. Again, the idea is that they will fill out these score sheets. They'll assign point values to the applicant, and that's what tells the story. They're not going to be compared to one another. One thing I also want to avoid is, even though we're using score sheets, I don't love the idea of a judge assigning a point value, because they get very hung up on like what associates with what, number. Like, what is a 4 versus a 5, or what's a 3 versus a 4? So what I would prefer to see instead is some type of like question-based score sheet, like good, great, ugly, below average, average, above average, great. That way they're kind of ranking off of like some type of emotional impact. And then behind the scenes, there's a point value associated with those choices, so we can still leverage score sheets. So what does that look like? One thing, again, I talked about earlier was the blinding of data. So what we do in Reviewr is the review committees will come in and they basically get a menu, which is a listing of all of the applicants you want them to review. No, by no means is Reviewr blurry. This is just my way of showing that if you don't want to show people's names, or if you don't want to show demographic details, it does get completely removed from the review team's perspective. But they can save, they can log out, they can come back later. Again, we don't want them to do this in one sitting because they probably don't have time for it. We want to empower them to give the energy that it deserves. So review committees come in, they simply click on the name or the ID of who they're going to evaluate, and then they basically will get a split screen. So the left-hand side of their page will be the nomination packet. And I use that term broadly because you can actually control what content is being displayed to the review members, because from one phase of review to another, you might actually have different deliverables. It's quite possible that you want them to see the nomination and the application, or just the application. So you can kind of control all these things. But the review committee will actually side by side review the nomination form, and then off to the right, fill out their score sheet. And this is another great example kind of showing that they're not using like a 1 through 5 scale or a 1 through 10 scale. They're instead ranking between poor and exemplary. And then based off of those results, you will notice that there is a point value that gets automatically associated with the choices that were made, which then in return will power what I call leaderboard. So again, the idea is that if you are also reviewing things like file uploads or references, that on that exact same page, the review committee can kind of view the information side by side with their score sheet, being very sensitive to their time. And then this is that kind of leaderboard. So in real time, the system will say, hey, on a per award basis, here's all of the applicants, here's who review them, here's your total scores, here's your average scores. And then from there, a lot of our clients will use this as like a deliberations. They might say, hey, the system says Leslie is the highest rated applicant. Now let's talk about her and why we scored her the way that we did. In this case, it's pretty clear. However, Mark gave Sheldon the score of 12, but Judge Judy gave it a score of a 31, right? That's a pretty massive difference between the two of them. So then do we leverage the normalization report to figure out, like, is a 12 actually really, really good? Or do we let the two of them talk about why they review the way that they did? and then let your committees and let you as admins start to make some changes on the fly to the actual results. Because again, at Reviewr, we give you the data to make those decisions. We ourselves don't make those decisions for you. So with that said, I am going to open things up to Q&A. We're running at about 40 minutes here. So I'll hang out for as long as you want to answer any potential questions you might have. As I'm doing that, though, I do want to kind of go back to one last thing. I talked about the reference request process earlier, as well as the file upload. So I also want to help you kind of visualize what that looks like. So from a program operations perspective, you get a menu as well of all the candidates or all the applicants that you've collected. From there, you can kind of sort and filter by award categories, by statuses. You can open them up. Here's that concept called profile. So Leslie is the nominee. So within her nomination, we have her actual submission, as well as all the nomination forms submitted about her, the references that we submitted, and the file uploads. And so we try to take a concept of a binder and virtualize that. So if I jump up to the top of my page, you're going to notice I have obviously communication tools. I have a list of all the documents that were ever submitted. If I press view, you're going to notice that that document actually embeds itself right in our platform. But then very specifically is going to be those references. So this concept is called supplemental forms. So you'll notice that I have quite a few of those that were added. So Ann Perkins here submitted a reference on behalf of Leslie. What I can simply do then is click on Ann's name, and then it shows me the reference that was submitted. So yes, you can absolutely still do reference letters, because as you can see, there are file uploads here, but more specifically is you have like that template that I referred to earlier. Like, what are the 3 things you want the reference to talk about? Again, going back to the judging perspective, your review committees would actually be able to read those references embedded in Reviewr and blinded while leaving comments, notes, and score sheets. So comment about the question-based score sheet. So there's no right or wrong way to evaluate or judge nominations. Again, we have to be very sensitive to the review committee's both time as well as setting expectations. We don't want any confusion or a gray area, right? When they're coming in. And so the general idea here is that they're going to be able to very quickly, side by side, view the nominations and then like what the task at hand looks like. It kind of goes back to the concept of blinding as data as well. You might be collecting a whole bunch of information, but some of it may not even be relevant to the review process. And so if that is the case, like, don't even show it to them. That we can kind of keep things very, very consistent. But then again, yeah, I think, from a judging scorecard perspective, like, we don't want 25, 30 question score sheets. We want the application form, the questions and the essays being submitted have to be correlated to the categories and then your own organization's mission and vision. I hate metric-based application forms for the most part. Everybody who is being awarded has some type of achievement. I want their personalities to shine through. I want to learn more about how they're impacting our membership base and our community, and I want to celebrate them on that front. And so let's let our score sheet questions map one-to-one to those, which is also why I love the concept of both nominations and references, because it adds a very human and emotional bias and perspective to it. I also love video essays. It just adds a really cool marketing collateral that we can kind of leverage the videos that were submitted as at your galas. And then with that said, you can still use a very simple 5-question score sheet from good to great. But then if you have certain values or elements within your scorecard that you value more than others, we can do weighted scoring as well. So just because you might get a max of 5 on one question doesn't mean that's always the case. Really appreciate everybody's time today and attendance as well as your participation. Keep an eye out for both a follow-up to this webinar as well as some of those other resources that I'll be sharing in hopes that just kind of better the space. If there's anything that I can ever do for anybody on the call, please do let me know. Really appreciate it today.